We're going to examine the life of one of the most famous people of ancient Mesopotamia. Actually, his fame goes far beyond that, both in terms of the distance from his homeland, as well as the time period in which he lived. His name in the Akkadian language was Shurukin, which means legitimate king. Stories of his greatness were told for centuries, not only in the lands of Mesopotamia, which he conquered, but well beyond, in Anatolia, where Hittite kings and princes would study his battle tactics, and in Egypt, where scribes would study the unique system of administration that he developed. He was the closest thing to being a god in those days, and many people actually believed that he was one. He truly was an extraordinary persona. After all, we're still talking about him right now in our own day and age. The man I'm talking about, of course, is Sargon of Akkad, also known as Sargon the Great. In this program, we're going to discuss how one from purportedly such humble beginnings rose to become the greatest, most powerful person of his time. However, before we get into that, we need to first examine Sargon's early life in the land that today we call Iraq. In those days, at least locally, it was called Sumer. For the most part, this area had been dotted by multiple city-states along and in between the banks of the two great rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates. Since about 3000 BCE, these city-states were for the most part independent of each other, though they often fought for land, resources, and profitable trade routes. Every once in a while, certain cities would get the upper hand and influence or outright conquer their neighbors, but these would often be fleeting victories. Finally, around the year 2340 BCE, the king of Umma, Lugal-Zegezi, conquered pretty much all of Sumer and at least claims to have conquered many lands far beyond. His empire was short-lived because another, perhaps more capable ruler would arise to replace him. It's also around this time that our story of Sargon begins. His early life is still a bit of a mystery, and actually the sources we have may be more fiction than fact. Of the few documents that we do have, none of them are from his time, but were written down centuries later by Babylonian scribes, and they really just give what we'd call a mythical account of his birth. One of the more complete copies that have been found is in Akkadian and was supposedly written by Sargon himself. It was actually dug up in the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, and it goes like this. I quote, "Sargon, the strong king, the king of Akkad am I. My mother was a high priestess. My father I do not know. My paternal king inhabit the mountain region, and my home city is Azupiranu, meaning the saffron city, which lies on the bank of the Euphrates River. My mother, a high priestess, conceived me and bore me in secret. She placed me in a reed basket and caulked my hatch with pitch. Then she abandoned me to the river, from which I could not escape. The river carried me along and brought me to Aki, the water drawer." There are other versions and translations of this story, but this one seems to give the most detail. As I mentioned before, it's a copy by Babylonian scribes of what supposedly was the original. Another account of his early life is found in a Sumerian language text. In this story, Sargon, who is the cupbearer for Ur-Zababa, king of the city-state of Kish, has a prophetic dream. In this dream, the goddess Ishtar drowns Ur-Zababa in a river of blood. Being the loyal and dutiful servant that he is, Sargon tells this to Ur-Zababa, who is obviously a bit disturbed. Despite Sargon's known loyalty and service, Ur-Zababa interprets the dream as a warning that it's Sargon who will cause his demise. And so, he decides to act first and have his faithful servant killed. It should be noted that the position of cupbearer was actually an honor in ancient Mesopotamia. One who served in such a position was deemed to be a most trusted and esteemed advisor to the king. It turns out that the river of blood over Ur-Zababa was actually the invading army of King Lugal-Zegezi of Umma, who at the time was on a campaign of conquest throughout Mesopotamia. He'd already taken over the cities of Lagash, Girsu, Uruk, and Ur, pretty much all of the great cities of southern Mesopotamia. Now, he was marching north towards Kish. As you'd expect, Ur-Zubaba was terrified of losing his kingdom, as well as his life. And so, he sent Sargon on a mission with a letter to make peace with Lugal-Zaggisi. At least that's what Sargon was told. In reality, Ur-Zubaba's letter was an order for Lugal-Zaggisi to kill Sargon upon arrival. However, our hero though was under the divine protection of the goddess Ishtar, who warned him about Ur-Zubaba's treachery. Perhaps seeing that Sargon could provide valuable information about Ur-Zubaba and Kish, Lugal-Zaggisi instead invited him to join his forces in the fight against Ur-Zubaba. Together, they conquered Kish with relative ease. Ur-Zubaba, though, escapes, never to be heard from again. We're not told in the story exactly what happened next, but it seems that Sargon and Lugal-Zaggisi had a falling out, which caused the two former allies to become bitter enemies. Again, with Ishtar as his patron, Sargon is able to outsmart Lugal-Zaggisi, capture him in the city of Uruk, and then take him in chains to the holy city of Nippur, where he's tied to that city's gates like some sort of farm animal. With Lugal-Zaggisi defeated, Sargon proclaims himself to be the new king of Kish and quickly takes over all of Sumer and the northern lands known as Akkad. Other documents are a bit more specific and with less fantastical details. For example, the Sumerian King List, a document also compiled centuries after Sargon's death, states that he was the son of a date farmer and, like the story we just heard, became the cupbearer of the king of Kish, Ur-Zubaba. What's interesting to note is that many kings of the ancient world claim to be of noble or even divine descent. Sargon, on the other hand, at least in the two stories we've just looked at, seems to have had very humble beginnings, something which he himself never seems to have disputed. Everything that he did was due to the benevolence of his patron deity, the goddess Ishtar. Other than receiving divine favor, he was simply a man. An extraordinary man, but a man nevertheless. Sargon's life as king and emperor is much better documented with historical facts. Though Ishtar may have allowed Sargon to conquer Lugal-Zaggisi's new empire with relative ease, holding onto it proved to be a much greater challenge. Most of the city-states he claimed to have controlled rose up in rebellion against him. He was able to put down all of them, mostly by using a combination of fear, diplomacy, and probably in most cases, brute force. After consolidating his rule in Sumer, Sargon decided to expand outside of Mesopotamia proper and into all of the known areas of his world. According to his inscriptions, Sargon is said to have conquered or exacted tribute from kingdoms and cities as far as the eastern Mediterranean and the island of Cyprus to the distant lands of Elam. He ventured into the cedar forests of Lebanon, took the cities of Ebla, Mari, and parts of the land that would later be known as Assyria. However, did all of this really happen, or was it just, as some have suggested, merely propaganda to show Sargon's greatness to his subjects? Probably a mix. Few rulers were known to have been totally humble in their inscriptions. However, despite this, from historical documents and inscriptions of others that have been found in many parts of the Middle East, we can conclude with some certainty that Sargon in fact did fight and win many battles, both in and far from Sumer. For example, archaeologists have found the remains of several cities that were destroyed in northern Syria and southern Anatolia around the same time that Sargon claims to have campaigned there. However, it could also have been a coincidence, and like many events from the period, hard to conclusively prove. Regardless of whether he conquered all of these areas or not, Sargon left the lasting impression on his contemporaries and those who would come after him that he did. To break away from the old and help to usher in a new age, Sargon needed a new capital city. He built, or perhaps rebuilt, the city of Akkad, also known as Agade, on the banks of the Euphrates River. It was here that he built his primary royal palace, as well as temples for his patron goddess, Ishtar. With this new, loyal city as the base of his operations, Sargon began the great task of administrating his new empire. For the most part, Akkadian governors were appointed in all of the main city-states, with the Akkadian language being used as the official one for administrative purposes. This, though, doesn't mean that Sumerian wasn't used, as it was still the first language of the majority of residents in the core part of the empire. In addition, many Sumerian officials and scribes were allowed to keep their posts since honestly, it would have been foolish to dismiss them when they already knew the inner workings of how to run various aspects of the government, at least on a local level. Agade also served as the main commercial center for the empire. It was here that all sorts of valuable and tradable goods were brought, some from merchant caravans, but a great deal also from the taxes that were owed to the expanding empire. While it must have truly been a spectacular place, archaeologists have yet to find the exact location of Agade. As of now, its ruins are still buried beneath the sands of Iraq. Regardless though of what Sargon thought of himself, towards the end of his reign, he wasn't all-powerful, let alone very popular either. We're told that by his death, which as far as we know was from natural causes, there were multiple revolts throughout his empire, especially in Sumer. Eventually, these had to be brutally put down by his son and successor, Rimush. While it's obvious that Sargon, or at least his government, was resented by many, he must have been doing something right, because when he passed away in 2279 BCE, he had been on the throne for 56 years, one of the longest reigns of any historical monarch in Mesopotamia's history. And of course, the very fact that we are still talking about him over 4,000 years later must also be an indication that this was no ordinary man. Before we conclude, I want to read to you one last quote from Benjamin Foster's book, The Age of Agade. I quote, "For ambitious conquerors of the future, Sargon posed a challenge to emulate, having changed forever the concept of what one warrior king could achieve. The name and memory of Sargon remained in Mesopotamian consciousness, just as Alexander's lived on in the Mediterranean. His story was told in new ways to meet the expectations of different generations. Indeed, for a Mesopotamian historian of Alexander's own time, Sargon stood at the beginning of empirical human history, whereas the kings who lived before him were mythical figures whose exploits were performed in a world in which gods and human beings were characters in the same narratives. Sargon, though favored by the goddess Inanna, Ishtar, lived very much in the real world." So what happened after Sargon's death? We'll discuss that